The Cemetery Keeper's Curse. Jacob Harlow, a reclusive cemetery keeper, accidentally disturbs the rest of the dead while repairing a grave, awakening vengeful spirits. The cemetery's long-forgotten history begins to unravel as the restless dead seek retribution, pulling the living into their cursed domain. Chapter 1: The Keeper of Rest. Jacob Harlow was a solitary man. For 20 years, he had cared for Willowshade Cemetery, ensuring its grounds remained pristine and undisturbed. Each morning, he walked the rows of gravestones, fixing broken markers and pruning overgrown vines. The townsfolk rarely visited, leaving Jacob alone with his thoughts and the dead. One grey morning, a storm had left the cemetery soaked and littered with debris. Jacob found himself repairing a sunken grave at the farthest edge of the lot, where the oldest tombstones leaned haphazardly. The ground there was soft, and his shovel struck something solid beneath the surface. As he dug deeper, the shovel unearthed an ornate, blackened box. It was locked with heavy chains, etched with strange symbols he didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of him, and he pried it open. Inside was a pile of withered bones wrapped in cloth, and as Jacob stared, the air grew colder. The wind whispered his name, and he felt an unnatural shiver crawl up his spine. Chapter 2: Unearthed Secrets. That night, Jacob couldn't sleep. The storm returned with a vengeance, rattling the windows of his small caretaker's cabin. He swore he heard faint whispers, growing louder with each crash of thunder. Shadows danced unnaturally on the walls, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched made his skin crawl. The next day, he returned to the grave to rebury the box, but the hole was already filled. The soil was packed tightly as if it had never been disturbed. Yet, when he turned to leave, the gravestones seemed off. Names he had memorized after years of tending to the cemetery were missing, replaced by blank, weathered stone. The whispers followed him back to the cabin, growing louder each night. Chapter 3: The First Return. By the third night, Jacob knew something was terribly wrong. He awoke to find the cemetery gates ajar, though he had locked them at sundown. Pale figures wandered among the graves, their hollow eyes fixed on the ground. Panicking, he grabbed his lantern and ventured out to confront the intruders, but when he drew closer, his blood ran cold. These weren't intruders, they were the dead. "Jacob," one rasped, its voice like brittle leaves. "You've disturbed our slumber." The figures began to converge on him, their faces twisted with fury. Jacob stumbled back, clutching the lantern as his only weapon. "It was an accident," he cried. "I didn't mean to." But the dead didn't care for apologies. Chapter 4: A Town in Terror. The restless spirits didn't remain confined to the cemetery. By the following week, the townsfolk began to report strange occurrences: shadows passing by windows, phantom knocks on doors, and cold spots lingering in their homes. Jacob tried to warn the town, but his reputation as an odd, reclusive man worked against him. The mayor dismissed his claims, chalking the disturbances up to superstition. Only Mrs. Lark, the town historian, seemed to take him seriously. "There's a reason no one tends the graves at the cemetery's edge," she said gravely, pulling an old ledger from her shelves. "Those graves belong to the condemned, murderers, thieves, and witches. The box you found was their punishment, their souls locked away so they could never rise again." Jacob felt his stomach drop. "What happens now?" Mrs. Lark hesitated. "They'll seek revenge, unless you find a way to put them back to rest." Chapter 5: The Ritual of Binding. Mrs. Lark showed Jacob a set of instructions written in faded ink, a ritual to bind the spirits back to their graves. It required sacred herbs, a ceremonial blade, and a chant written in an ancient tongue. "Do it before the next full moon," she warned. "Otherwise, the spirits will fully manifest, and nothing will stop them." Jacob wasted no time, gathering the necessary items. But as the days passed, the hauntings grew more violent. Gravestones toppled, claw marks appeared on the walls of his cabin, and the whispers became screams. The dead were growing stronger. Chapter 6: The First Sacrifice. On the eve of the full moon, Jacob prepared to perform the ritual at the grave where he had unearthed the box. But the spirits had other plans. As he approached, a chilling wail erupted, and a spectral figure lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. It was Old Man Greaves, the town's infamous murderer who had been hanged over a century ago. "Your soul for mine," the ghost snarled, its bony hands wrapping around Jacob's throat. Jacob managed to cut the spirit with the ceremonial blade, and it dissolved into a cloud of ash. But he knew this was only the beginning. The dead wouldn't let him complete the ritual without a fight. Chapter 7: A Town United. Desperate, Jacob called on the townsfolk for help. Reluctantly, they joined him, armed with lanterns, torches, and salt to ward off the spirits. Together, they formed a protective circle around the cursed grave while Jacob began the chant. The spirits emerged from the fog, more numerous and ferocious than before. They clawed at the circle, their cries piercing the night. One by one, the townsfolk faltered, breaking formation and falling prey to the ghosts. Chapter 8: A Deal with the Damned. As the ritual neared completion, the spirits grew more desperate. One approached Jacob, speaking in a voice that was both seductive and chilling. "Stop this, and we will spare the town," it promised. "But if you finish, our wrath will consume them all." Jacob hesitated, the weight of the town's survival pressing down on him. But Mrs. Lark's voice echoed in his mind, "They'll seek revenge unless you stop them completely." Chapter 9: The Final Act. With renewed determination, Jacob completed the chant, slamming the ceremonial blade into the ground. A shockwave of light burst from the grave, sending the spirits wailing back into the earth. The silence that followed was deafening. The cemetery was still, and the fog began to lift. But as Jacob surveyed the damage, he realized the cost of his actions. Several townsfolk lay lifeless, their faces frozen in terror. The ritual had saved the town, but not without sacrifice. Chapter 10: The Eternal Watcher. Jacob returned to his solitary life, forever changed by what had happened. The cemetery seemed peaceful, but he knew the dead were merely dormant, waiting for another careless mistake. He built a shrine over the cursed grave, vowing to protect it for the rest of his days. And as he walked the rows of gravestones each morning, he felt their eyes on him, a constant reminder of the price of his curiosity. The cemetery had claimed its keeper, and Jacob knew he would never truly escape its curse. The Blackened Woods. When a wildfire devastates the Verdant Grove National Forest, it exposes ancient bones buried deep beneath the soil. The bones belonged to a creature long thought to be a myth, its spirit awakened and vengeful. Anyone who dares to step into the burnt forest becomes prey for the malevolent force, which grows stronger with each victim. Chapter 1: Ashes and Secrets. The wildfire had been the worst in decades, leaving nothing but charred remnants of the once vibrant Verdant Grove National Forest. Park Ranger Eliza Moore stood at the edge of the devastation, her boots sinking into the ashen ground. The air was heavy with the acrid stench of burnt wood, and a haunting silence hung over the forest. As Eliza walked deeper into the blackened woods, her foot caught on something solid. She knelt to inspect it, brushing away the soot to reveal a massive, bleached bone. At first, she thought it was from a large animal, perhaps a bear. But as she unearthed more bones, she realized they were unlike anything she had ever seen. The proportions were all wrong, too long, too jagged, and impossibly old. She felt a strange chill despite the lingering heat of the scorched earth. The discovery unsettled her, but she shrugged it off and marked the location to report later. What she didn't notice was the faint shimmer of movement in the shadows, as if something was watching her. Chapter 2: The Unearthed Beast. News of the bones spread quickly. Paleontologists, archaeologists, and curious thrill-seekers descended upon Verdant Grove, eager to examine the strange find. Dr. Aaron Blythe, a renowned archaeologist, was the first to declare the bones ancient, potentially belonging to a creature predating human history. Eliza was assigned to escort Dr. Blythe and his team through the site. As they excavated, they uncovered more of the skeleton, a towering, monstrous shape that defied logic. Its skull was elongated, with jagged teeth that seemed to grin menacingly even in death. The team marveled at their discovery, but Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air grew colder the closer they got to the bones, and the once silent forest began to echo with faint whispers, too soft to discern but impossible to ignore. That night, as the team packed up their equipment, one of the researchers went missing. His tent was empty, his belongings untouched, and the only clue was a set of deep claw marks leading away from the camp. Chapter 3: The First Hunt. The search party began at dawn, but the forest felt alien, its charred landscape twisting and turning as if trying to confuse them. Eliza led the group, her flashlight scanning the skeletal trees for any sign of the missing man. They found him at the edge of a dried creek bed, his body mangled and barely recognizable. Surrounding him were strange footprints, massive and clawed, leading deeper into the forest. What could have done this? One of the rangers whispered, his voice trembling. Eliza shook her head, unable to answer. But as the group stood frozen in fear, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. "Run," Eliza whispered, and they did. Chapter 4: The Spirit Awakens. Back at the ranger station, Eliza tried to make sense of what had happened. The tracks didn't match any known predator, and the sheer size of the creature they hinted at defied explanation. She remembered the whispers she had heard near the bones and realized they had started the moment the excavation began. Dr. Blythe, however, was ecstatic. He was convinced they had uncovered something monumental, something that could rewrite history. "We can't stop now," he argued. "This discovery is too important." Eliza tried to warn him, but he dismissed her concerns as superstition. That night, as the team camped near the excavation site, the forest came alive with the sound of snapping branches and guttural snarls. Chapter 5: A Growing Threat. The creature struck again, claiming 2 more lives before vanishing into the shadows. The survivors described a horrifying figure cloaked in smoke and ash, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Eliza and Dr. Blythe barely escaped, retreating to the ranger station. As they regrouped, they scoured the forest's history for answers. Local legends spoke of a devouring beast, a creature worshipped and feared by an ancient tribe. The tribe had sealed its remains beneath the forest, believing its spirit would remain dormant so long as the bones were undisturbed. "We woke it up," Eliza whispered. "And now it's hunting." Chapter 6: Trapped in the Ashes. The forest became a death trap. The fog that rolled in each evening was thick and unnatural, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers and growls. Radios stopped working, and the roads leading out of Verdant Grove seemed to loop back on themselves, trapping everyone within the forest's cursed boundaries. Eliza took charge, organizing the remaining survivors and fortifying the ranger station. Dr. Blythe, consumed by guilt, finally admitted that he had ignored warnings etched into the bones, symbols he thought were decorative but were actually ancient seals. "We need to put it back," he said. Chapter 7: The Ritual of Containment. The survivors found an ancient journal in the ranger station's archives, written by a settler who had encountered the tribe centuries ago. It detailed a ritual to bind the spirit, requiring a sacrifice of fire, blood, and earth. Eliza, Dr. Blythe, and the others gathered the necessary components, venturing into the forest despite the creature's looming presence. Each step felt heavier, the whispers louder, as if the forest itself was trying to stop them. Chapter 8: The Final Stand. The ritual site was a clearing surrounded by blackened trees, their branches twisted like clawed hands. As Eliza began the chant, the creature appeared, emerging from the shadows with terrifying speed. The survivors fought to hold it off, using fire and makeshift weapons to keep it at bay. Dr. Blythe was struck down, his sacrifice buying them precious time. Eliza continued the chant, her voice rising above the chaos. The ground beneath the creature began to tremble, pulling it downward. Its screams were deafening, a mix of rage and desperation, but the ritual held. Chapter 9: Sealed Away. When the creature was finally consumed by the earth, the forest grew eerily silent. The fog lifted, and the survivors felt the weight of the curse dissipate. Eliza collapsed in exhaustion, her mind racing with the cost of their victory. The remaining survivors buried the bones deep beneath the earth and marked the site with warnings. Verdant Grove National Forest was officially closed, declared unsafe for human entry. Chapter 10: The Lingering Shadow. Years later, Eliza visited the forest's edge, now overgrown and reclaimed by nature. She placed a hand on the warning sign, her mind filled with memories of the horrors she had faced. As she turned to leave, a faint whisper reached her ears. She froze, her heart pounding. The forest was watching. The forgotten funeral home. An old funeral home, long abandoned, becomes the epicenter of strange occurrences. Coffins mysteriously appear in its halls, doors creak open on their own, and whispers echo through the night. When a group of investigators attempts to uncover the truth, they find themselves trapped, reliving the horrors of the funeral home's dark history. Chapter 1. The First Sign. Mason Blake had always been drawn to old, forgotten places. As a freelance photographer specializing in urban decay, he'd visited abandoned schools, factories, and even a crumbling hospital. But the dilapidated Danforth Funeral Home on the outskirts of town carried an eerie reputation that set it apart from the rest. Locals whispered about its sudden closure decades ago and the rumors that the undertaker, Arthur Danforth, had disappeared without a trace. The overgrown lawn and boarded-up windows only added to its unsettling charm. Mason set up his tripod in front of the weathered building, ready to capture its haunting beauty. As he adjusted his camera, he noticed something odd. The main door, which had been nailed shut when he arrived, was now slightly ajar. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Delivery. The next morning, the police received an unusual report. A delivery driver claimed he'd found a hearse parked in front of the old funeral home, its back door open and a pristine, white coffin inside. Officer Elena Cruz, skeptical but curious, arrived at the scene to investigate. Sure enough, the hearse was there, and the coffin inside looked brand new. The lid was unsealed. "What kind of prank is this?" she muttered, carefully opening the coffin. It was empty. As she turned to leave, the faint sound of whispering made her freeze. It seemed to be coming from the funeral home itself. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no reply, only the sound of the door creaking as it swung open wider. Chapter 3. A team assembled. Word of the strange happenings at Danforth Funeral Home spread quickly. Mason, intrigued by the driver's story, reached out to a local paranormal investigator named Avery Steele. Together, they formed a small team to explore the building. Mason, Avery, and Elena, who felt compelled to uncover the truth after her unsettling experience. "Whatever's happening here, it's tied to the past," Avery said as they stood outside the funeral home that night. Elena held a flashlight tightly. "Let's just figure it out and get out of here." The group entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the silent halls. Dust-covered furniture and faded wallpaper hinted at the funeral home's once prosperous past. But the air was heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath. Then, they saw it, a coffin resting in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that hadn't been there before. Chapter 4. The whispers grow louder. The team stared at the coffin in stunned silence. "Who lit these candles?" Mason whispered. Avery pulled out her recording equipment. "If anyone's here with us, please make yourself known," she called into the darkness. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the faint whispers began again, growing louder with each passing second. They seemed to come from every direction, overlapping and indistinguishable. Elena aimed her flashlight at the walls. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw shadowy handprints smeared across the peeling wallpaper. Mason backed away from the coffin. "This place isn't abandoned. Someone, or something, is here." Chapter 5. The Undertaker's Ledger. In one of the offices, Avery discovered an old ledger on a dusty desk. It contained a record of all the funerals conducted at the home, but the last few entries were disturbing. The names of the deceased were scratched out, replaced with a single word, unclaimed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the dates. The final entry was from the night Arthur Danforth vanished. Elena frowned. Why would he record unclaimed bodies? And what happened to them? As if in response, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers surged, louder and clearer. This time, they could make out words. "Help us, trapped, can't rest." Chapter 6. The Basement Door. Drawn by the whispers, the group followed the sound to a locked door at the end of the hall. Elena forced it open, revealing a staircase leading to the basement. The air grew colder with each step they descended, the oppressive atmosphere almost unbearable. The basement was lined with rows of empty caskets, their lids askew. At the far end of the room stood a large furnace. Avery shivered. "It's like they left in the middle of..." Before she could finish, The furnace roared to life, casting flickering shadows on the walls. In the orange glow, Mason noticed something horrifying. Faint outlines of faces pressed against the walls, their mouths open in silent screams. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. Avery's equipment began to glitch as she picked up a voice distinct from the others, a low, guttural growl. "Leave now, or suffer." Elena's hands trembled as she held her flashlight steady. "What is this place?" Avery turned to the ledger in her hands. "I think the unclaimed weren't buried. They were burned, but something went wrong. Their spirits are trapped here." Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the furnace's glow. It was Arthur Danforth, or what remained of him, a twisted, charred form that radiated malevolence. "You disturbed my sanctuary," he hissed. Chapter 8. The Escape. The room erupted into chaos. The shadows peeled from the walls, coalescing into figures that reached for the group. Elena fired her gun, the sound deafening in the confined space, but the bullets had no effect. Mason grabbed Avery's arm. "We have to get out of here." The three of them sprinted up the stairs, the whispers now a deafening roar. Coffins toppled over as unseen forces tried to block their path. When they finally burst through the front door, the funeral home was silent once more. Chapter 9. A Hollow Victory. They reconvened at Elena's apartment, shaken but alive. "We didn't stop it," Avery said, staring at the ledger. "Those spirits are still trapped in there." Elena nodded. "But if we go back, we might not make it out again." Mason looked out the window at the dark horizon. "The world needs to know what happened there. Maybe someone braver than us can finish what we started." Chapter 10. The Final Visit. Weeks later, the funeral home was demolished. But as the wrecking ball swung, workers reported hearing faint cries from beneath the rubble. A local historian found a small, charred ledger among the ruins. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "They will never rest, and neither will I." From then on, strange lights and whispers were reported near the site, as though the funeral home refused to be forgotten. The voice from the lake. In the heart of a secluded forest lies a mist-shrouded lake where a mysterious voice calls out to anyone who lingers near its shores. The voice promises to fulfill the deepest desires of those who dare to dive into its murky waters. But those who answer the call find that their wishes come at an unspeakable price. Chapter 1. The Legend of Echo Lake. Nestled deep within the Blackwood Forest, Echo Lake was infamous for its eerie reputation. Locals told stories of the strange voice that called out across the misty waters. Some claimed it was the spirit of a woman who had drowned centuries ago. Others said it was something far older, far darker. Naomi Carter had grown up hearing the tales but never believed them. Now, as a struggling journalist desperate for a story, she returned to her childhood town to investigate the mystery. Standing on the lake's shore, the dense fog swirling around her, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold autumn air. Naomi. Her heart stopped as the whisper echoed across the water. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, soft, melodic, and undeniably real. Chapter 2. A Whispered Promise. The next morning, Naomi visited the local library to dig deeper into the legend. The librarian, Mrs. Hensley, was reluctant to talk but eventually shared a faded newspaper clipping from the 1930s. 10 Missing at Echo Lake, the headline read. The article described a group of campers who vanished after reporting a mysterious voice luring them into the water. Their bodies were never found. Later that evening, Naomi returned to the lake with her recording equipment. She stood at the edge, her reflection shimmering in the dark water. "If there's anyone here, speak to me," she called. A long silence followed. Just as she was about to pack up, the voice returned, this time clearer and closer. "I know what you want, Naomi. I can give it to you." She froze. "What are you talking about?" "Your career, your success. Dive into the water, and it will all be yours." Chapter 3. The Bargain. Naomi couldn't shake the voice from her mind. That night, she dreamt of the lake, its waters glowing with an otherworldly light. The voice called to her again, promising everything she'd ever desired. The next day, she confided in her childhood friend, Ethan, who now worked as a park ranger. "You're not seriously thinking of diving into that lake, are you?" he asked, his expression grim. It's probably just some weird acoustics or a prank, Naomi said, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan shook his head. People have gone missing here, Naomi. Don't mess with it. But as night fell, she found herself drawn back to the lake. The fog was thicker than ever, and the voice was waiting for her. Come closer, Naomi. The water will embrace you. Chapter 4, Into the Depths. Unable to resist the pull, Naomi waded into the icy water. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Deeper, just a little deeper. As the water reached her chest, she hesitated. What are you? She whispered. The voice chuckled softly. I am the answer to your prayers. Taking a deep breath, Naomi dove beneath the surface. The water was cold and dark, and her heart pounded as she swam further down. Then, she saw it, a faint, glowing light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. When she resurfaced, gasping for air, the fog was gone, and the lake was eerily calm. On the shore, she found an envelope with her name on it. Inside was a job offer from a prestigious magazine, the opportunity she'd been chasing for years. Chapter 5, The Price. At first, everything seemed perfect. Naomi's career skyrocketed, her articles gaining widespread acclaim. But strange things began to happen. She would catch glimpses of her reflection moving on its own, its lips forming words she couldn't hear. Her dreams were plagued by visions of the lake and shadowy figures rising from its depths. And the voice followed her everywhere, whispering reminders of the bargain she'd made. You owe me, Naomi. Don't forget. Chapter 6, Ethan's Discovery. Concerned by Naomi's erratic behavior, Ethan began his own investigation. He discovered journal entries from previous victims of the lake's curse, each describing similar promises and the horrors that followed. One entry stood out. The voice gives, but it also takes. The deeper you dive, the more it consumes. Ethan raced to warn Naomi, but she was already spiraling. Her success had come at a cost. She was losing herself, her reflection no longer her own. Chapter 7, The Shadows Return. One night, Naomi woke to find her apartment filled with water, though the floors were dry. Shadowy figures loomed in the corners, their faces featureless. You brought us here, they whispered in unison. We are the price. Terrified, Naomi fled to Ethan's cabin. It's the lake, she sobbed. It's coming for me. Ethan nodded grimly. We have to end this. We have to go back. Chapter 8, The Final Confrontation. Armed with salt and ancient wards he'd found in the journal, Ethan and Naomi returned to the lake. The fog was thicker than ever, and the voice was waiting. Naomi, you can't escape me. As the water began to ripple and churn, Ethan shouted incantations while Naomi threw the wards into the lake. The voice howled in rage, and the fog transformed into writhing tendrils, reaching for them. You are mine, Naomi. Chapter 9, The Sacrifice. Realizing the wards weren't enough, Naomi made a decision. It wants me, Ethan. I have to go back. No. Ethan grabbed her arm, but she broke free and plunged into the lake. The water swallowed her whole, and the voice roared with triumph. For a moment, the lake glowed brighter than ever. Then, the fog began to dissipate, and the water grew still. Ethan called out for Naomi, but there was no response. Chapter 10, A Haunting Echo. Weeks later, Ethan visited the lake one last time. The fog was gone, and the water looked deceptively peaceful. But as he turned to leave, he heard it. Ethan. The voice was soft, familiar. He froze, his heart sinking. Help me. Naomi's voice echoed across the lake, a chilling reminder that no one ever truly escapes its grasp. The Foggy Bridge. Shrouded in perpetual mist, the Foggy Bridge is avoided by locals who speak of a ghostly ferryman who offers passage across its haunting expanse. Those who accept his offer are never seen again, vanishing into a sinister dimension where the living become the hunted. Chapter 1, The Bridge in the Mist. It was said that the Foggy Bridge had been abandoned for decades. Spanning a narrow gorge on the edge of town, the bridge was enveloped in a thick fog that never lifted, no matter the time of day or season. Leah Bennett had heard the stories all her life, tales of travelers who wandered onto the bridge and disappeared without a trace. Now, as a freelance photographer in search of eerie locales, Leah saw the bridge as the perfect subject. But standing before it, her camera in hand, she hesitated. The mist seemed alive, swirling unnaturally, whispering her name. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination, and stepped onto the bridge. The fog thickened, swallowing her whole. Chapter 2: The ferryman appears. As Leah walked further, her footsteps echoed unnaturally. The air grew colder, and a strange figure emerged from the mist. It was a man, or at least something that resembled one. Dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, he leaned on a crooked staff. "Crossing, are we?" His voice was gravelly, each word dripping with malice. "I'm just here to take pictures," Leah replied, her voice trembling. The ferryman chuckled. "Pictures? Yes, many have come for such frivolities. Few leave." He gestured to a small, creaking boat moored at the edge of the bridge, its appearance both sudden and unsettling. "I'm not looking to cross," Leah said, taking a step back. "Once you've entered the fog, you must choose. Turn back, or let me guide you forward." His voice echoed, and the fog seemed to press in tighter. Chapter 3: A Step Too Far. Against her better judgment, Leah decided to explore further, ignoring the ferryman's warnings. She continued down the bridge, snapping photos as she went. But with every step, the bridge seemed to stretch farther into the mist. The fog grew denser, and shapes began to emerge within it, shadowy, distorted figures that seemed to watch her. Her camera flashed, briefly illuminating them, but when she lowered it, the shadows were gone. Her heart raced as she turned back toward the way she'd come, only to find the path obscured. The ferryman's voice echoed around her. "Forward is the only way now." Chapter 4: The First Crossing. Panicked, Leah ran back toward the ferryman, who stood waiting by his boat. "Fine," she said, her voice unsteady. "Take me across." The ferryman's grin was chilling as he helped her into the boat. The water beneath the bridge was black and still, reflecting nothing. As they drifted further into the mist, Leah noticed strange symbols carved into the boat's wooden frame. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To where all who cross must go." The boat reached the other side, but what lay ahead was no ordinary landscape. The air smelled of decay, and the ground was a twisted, barren expanse littered with skeletal remains. Chapter 5: The Sinister Dimension. Leah stepped off the boat, her legs trembling. The sky above was an unnatural shade of red, and the air vibrated with an ominous hum. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, too fast to follow. "You wanted to see," the ferryman said, his voice taunting. "Now you must stay." Leah turned to argue, but the ferryman and his boat were gone. She was alone. The shadows grew bolder, drawing closer. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, and Leah realized she wasn't just being watched, she was being hunted. Chapter 6: A Fateful Discovery. Desperate for shelter, Leah stumbled across an old, crumbling tower. Inside, she found carvings similar to those on the ferryman's boat, along with a journal. The journal belonged to a man named Elias, who had crossed the bridge decades ago. His entries described the same haunting world, the same relentless predators. "The ferryman thrives on our despair," he had written. "But there is a way back. The toll must be paid." Leah's heart sank. The journal gave no clue as to what the toll was, only that it required a piece of the soul. Chapter 7: The Hunt Begins. Nightfall in the sinister dimension brought horrors Leah couldn't have imagined. The growls turned into deafening roars as monstrous creatures emerged from the shadows. Their bodies were grotesque amalgamations of bone and sinew, their eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. She ran, her breath ragged, her legs burning. Every path seemed to twist back on itself, leading her in circles. But as dawn approached, the creatures retreated, and the ferryman's voice echoed through the barren land. "Ready to pay the toll, Leah?" Chapter 8: The Toll of Freedom. Leah followed the voice, finding the ferryman waiting by his boat. "What is the toll?" she demanded. He smirked. "A memory. One you hold most dear." She hesitated, her mind racing. The memory of her late mother, their final conversation, was the only thing keeping her grounded. To lose it would mean losing a part of herself. I can't, she whispered. Then stay. Chapter 9. A desperate bargain. Days passed, and Leah grew weaker. The creatures were relentless, their attacks growing bolder with each night. Finally, she returned to the ferryman, her resolve hardened. Take the memory, she said. The ferryman's grin widened as he reached out, his hand passing through her forehead. Pain seared through her as the memory was ripped away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Farewell, he said, gesturing to the boat. Chapter 10. The Escape. Leah awoke on the original side of the bridge, the fog lifting around her. She felt different, empty, yet free. Her camera was gone, her photos erased, as if none of it had ever happened. But when she looked into the water below, the ferryman's reflection stared back at her, grinning. His voice echoed in her mind. Once crossed, the bridge never forgets. Leah walked away, vowing never to return, but the hollow ache in her chest reminded her that the toll had been paid, and that the ferryman was always watching.